welcome to Politics of Memory. Today we are with Bongani Kona and with Joanne Joseph and C.A. Davids. I want to begin by welcoming you all here, and please know that you, our lovely audience, are to please wear your masks for the duration of the event. So where to begin? I'm very nervous, but I'm also very excited. It's a great privilege to be in a conversation with the three of you. And I feel very grateful that Open Book has invited me to be in conversation with the three of you. And so I have the privilege of, we all have the privilege of thinking through the politics of memory and exploring what we choose to remember and why. So I have no doubt that these three literary works will animate discussion and debate around the very idea of power and remembrance and the master narrative. And so How to Be a Revolutionary, Children of Sugarcane and Our Ghosts Were Once People are evocative works, I feel, that grapple with living with legacies of loss, of absence, erasure, exclusion, foreclosures. And I want to thank you for creating these works and bringing them to us, because I think that they encourage us to question whose histories are told and to think about how histories are told and can be told. So with that, just a history of who our three authors are. C.A. Davids is a writer and editor living in Cape Town. Her fiction has appeared in Twist and African Pen's New Writing from Southern Africa, published by New Africa Books in April 2007. Her debut novel, The Blacks of Cape Town, published in 2013, which was brilliant, was shortlisted for the Edinburgh International Book Festival First Book Award and the University of Johannesburg Debut Writing Prize and the Sala First Time.
I didn't win any.
Shortlisted. I said, did I say win? Did I
I
say that you won?
You didn't say shortlisted.
Maybe I feel you should have won. Sorry, shortlisted for the Sala First Time Published Author Award. Her most recent novel, How to Be a Revolutionary, has just hit shelves and will be and has been incredibly well received. So, welcome to you. Joanne Joseph is an established South African media personality and best-selling author with over 20 years of broadcasting experience, and she has hosted prominent radio and television shows for major broadcasters, including the South African Broadcasting Corporation and Prime Media House. Her book, Drug Mule, sold over 10,000 copies, and Children of Sugarcane is Joanne's first work of fiction. So welcome to you.
Thanks, Cindy.
And then Bongani Kona is a writer and editor and lecturer in the Department of History at the University of Western Cape. And his work has appeared in a variety of places, including Chimurenga, Safe House Explorations in Creative Nonfiction, The Daily Assortment of Astonishing Things and Other Stories, The Baffler, and BBC Radio 4. He was awarded the Ruth First Fellowship in 2019 and was shortlisted for the Kane Prize for African Writing in 2016. Most recently, he has edited Our Ghosts Were Once People. So if you haven't bought the books yet, I strongly encourage you to get your hands on these and get the signatures from the authors when we're done. So for me, before we get into the questions, I'm going to ask all three of you to read and to give all of us a taste of the beauty of your writing. But I was just writing notes as I was preparing for this over the past few weeks and reading your work and thinking about this. And I think, here we have 3 enthralling literary works, spilling over with beauty, cruelty at times. There's something very haunting about the work. And the writers, in my opinion, seamlessly are able to weave historical details and truths through their evocative and imaginative and lyrical creations. And so when we reflect on the style and the mesmerizing, the truly, truly mesmerizing authenticity of the language in the writing, which is a conversation I'd like us to have later, we find that we are endlessly struck by how each sentence is crafted with exacting care, is my feeling. And so on that note, could I ask all 3 of you to just give us a sense of the writing and just a taste of what everyone's gonna eventually read when they get home tonight?
I think we should start with CA.
Okay. Hi everyone, thank you. It feels a bit weird to be in front of an audience and to be with so many people in one room. So I'm not the most confident public reader, so please bear with me if I, yeah. So my novel is How to Be a Revolutionary. It's set on 3 continents, or at least in 3 different cities, and this is Shanghai, and this is chapter 1. The repetitive beat of typewriter keys always amplified at around 1 a.m. because this was the time when life on the street below stalled. Shanghai never became truly quiet. Only in the slip of time between midnight and 4 a.m. did the traffic recede and the noise temporarily wane. All day long, the din of construction filled the air as cranes and gantries, as common to the sky as birds and planes to other cities, crisscrossed the grey. Bamboo scaffolding woven intricately as fine cotton gave shape to the vertical city, while beneath, shift workers arrived all day long, the hum and thrust of metal always in the distance. In those months when I was new to the city and its unfathomable sounds, I knew this was the time, if any, that I would hear him typing. The procession of taps and clicks was followed by a quick ring, a slow zip. Familiar sounds that had echoed throughout my childhood when my mother brought home extra work. It kept time to my weakening eyelids until, as always, I lost the battle. There was no music now in the beat that seeped through the skin of cement, and I knew my neighbor from above used only one finger. Ai said he was a man. She'd seen him smoking on the balcony one morning. At least, I think she said this. She didn't speak a word of English, and I'd learned only the most perfunctory Mandarin. Hello, goodbye, thank you, excuse me, how much for that? No, that, and so on. A combination of signs, gestures, and incomprehensible words stitched together my and Ai's communication about the work she had to do when she came to clean. We never said much more, and I only gleaned a bit of information about my neighbor when something crashed one morning in the apartment above, surprising us both. Nearly made it.
Beautiful, thank you. Absolutely. Who's up next?
Joe? Yeah, we're going down the line.
You just volunteer us, Steve. And I just want to say thank you, CA, for bringing this copy of my book. When I packed, I was so busy putting their books into my bag that I forgot to bring my own, so thanks very much for that. So this particular part of the book deals with the protagonist being arrested for a crime and being jailed shortly afterwards, and this is what happens while she's in prison. And yet something quite miraculous happened as I was led away from the plantation. It prompted me to snap my head around to see who was watching, who was whispering, even as the policeman handcuffed me. I saw no one but the other laborers looking on in silence. But that night, as I lay on the stone-cold floor of the jail, I sensed it again, a rip in time's canvas through which small fragments escaped. I saw etchings on faces, ridges on hands, a lock, a tress of flowing hair, all with great clarity. I found myself swept backwards to a day when I stood bowed on that plantation with a scythe in my hands. I remembered how I had slowly tried to orientate my face towards Vakuruthi in the hope that it was all still there. The magnificent rock-cut temples of the Pallava dynasty on the river banks, the pillared halls and shrines that rose up in worship of the great Shiva in Mahabalipuram, the Sanskrit writings that had endured wars and the destruction of empires. And I stood a little more erect, even when the lash of the whip met my back. I sat up in my cell and stared into the dark. If time was conspiring to unravel my bonds, I would ask it to carry me back to that child, Shanti, ebullient and unspoilt by the world. I am waiting, I said. Come and take me.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm also going to read a page from my piece in the book, which is called The Descendants, and it begins with an epigraph from a poem by Habiba Badaroun called Promised Land, which goes, "Our forgetting is also our home and why we never left the old country." An old black and white portrait of him hung in our living room. His slanted signature marked the books on our shelves. And once a month, Cousin T and I walked my grandmother Agnes to the post office to collect his pension, until the checks stopped coming in the late 90s. By then, all the money had been stolen by officials. She'd also get a monthly sum from the War Victims Compensation Fund. Like her husband, whom she never mentioned, Agnes had been a school teacher. She'd take us to the library on our way home from the post office. The books we read depicted suburban, white childhoods full of ease. We lived on a quiet street in a residential neighborhood called Hatfield in the south of Harare. It had been laid out as a whites-only suburb in 1920. 6 decades later, as the era of settler colonialism drew to a close, droves of white families sold their houses on the cheap and left the country. My grandmother, with the help of her children, purchased one of those properties on the eve of Zimbabwe's independence in 1980, moving there from Farm 61, a home she had shared with her husband in Msengezi, an erstwhile native purchase area. She never returned to Farm 61, though it was hardly an hour's drive away. Or rather, she only went there to commit the dead to our family graveyard. In my lifetime, I saw her bury her remaining two sons, a daughter who died in a psychiatric facility, and a nephew who hanged himself on the farm in 2008. The police took 4 hours to arrive and cut Cousin P down. His father stood by him that whole time, in the rain, among the pines and gum trees. But that, as the saying goes, is a story for a different time. I have a favor to ask, because Cindy also contributed 2 of her poems to the book, and if it's okay, could I ask her to read one of her poems?
Yes, Mr. Editor, I will. Okay, so you wanted me to read Used Car Salesman?
Whichever you want from the 2.
Sure, okay, maybe, yeah, let's do the one. The Used Car Salesman, 1973. He sold cars, used cars, with his friend Eugene. They owned a small business near the BP garage on the corner of Bongani Road and Argyle. Eugene did most of the paperwork from their small office. 1976. It was an aluminium trailer with a mishmash of old carpets scattered everywhere and large beige filing cabinets near his desk. There were always 3 or 4 ashtrays around the office, always full with cigarette butts and peanut shells. Dad did most of the repairs from home and brought them in after he made sure they were roadworthy. 1985. Our house always had around 6 or so cars littered across the garden, most of them high up on ramps with bricks behind the back wheels. He was always working underneath them with a large blue toolbox folded out. 1988. The 85 Toyota Corolla 1.6 GL had been in an accident, so he was fixing the wheel alignment. He said it was crabbing. The needle of the speedometer in the 1988 BMW E28 wasn't moving anymore. There was an annoying misfire from the 1973 VW Beetle 1600, and the 1985 Jaguar JX needed a new fan belt. And the 1676 Mercedes 240D had bad rust around the windscreen. It was smoking excessively and the exhaust had 2 holes. 1992. For years, he bled brakes, flushed fluid out of master brake cylinders, brake lines and calipers, fixing starters and alternators and replacing CV joints. After almost 6 years together, Dad was dying in hospital. The business shut down. The cars were sold off, but the Corolla was the last to remain. A buyer was going to come around at 5 p.m. to look at the car. While we hosed it down and dried it off with the chamois and vacuumed inside, I opened the cubbyhole to make sure it was empty, and there it sat. The torn piece of paper reads, "The will is in the safe. Look after my little girl. Tell her that I love her. Help her not to cry too much." Thank you. So, I am so nervous. I need to just relax. When I was reading the intro, my knee was doing this. And I had a nightmare that I'd go blank last night. Thank you for reading that. And this is exactly what I'm talking about when I say that the work is enthralling, that there's exacting care put into the sentence construction, the language, the world building that goes on in all 3 works is remarkable. I feel incredibly privileged to have had the opportunity to read them and to have this conversation. So as we think about what we choose to remember and why, I'm really eager to have a discussion and talk about the crafting of worlds and that are laced with such detailed intimacy, right? And so, would you mind talking to us about how the work of memory shaped your writing in order to create these vivid characters and landscapes that travel across 19th century India to the sugarcane plantations of Natal, from Shanghai to Cape Town to China, Zimbabwe? How does the work of memory resonate with you, and how important is it as you craft?
You should start. Yeah,
You go on. Your turn. Oh, really? Okay. How does the work of memory, say that again. Sorry, I always said that. It's weird being with so many people. Say that again, please.
No, I'm trying to understand the work of memory. So your work travels across all of these different continents and you create these incredibly vivid characters. And I'm sure that the work of memory was really significant to you, especially when we think about how detailed the writing is. It's so evident that memory had to have played a really big role. So I suppose I'm trying to understand the process of writing for you.
I mean, it's interesting that you speak about the work of memory, because when I was writing the novel, something which became really important was memories which never make it to the archive, right? So much of the novel is set in Shanghai, although it is also in South Africa. And one of the characters basically has lived through really, I mean, I think it's something like 40 million people died in China during the Great Leap Forward. I think more than 40 million. It actually outnumbers the amount of people from World War II if the archives, they actually, the memories have made it into the archives. We don't really know, today in China, many of the things which I've written in the novel, it's actually banned, it's forbidden to speak about, simply because that's what keeps communist China functioning as it does. And I mean, I suppose this is the way we all function, censorship, self-censorship. And so, yes, there are memories, but whose memories are they, I suppose, in a way, in contemporary China? Many young people simply don't know this history of their country because they're not allowed to know. It's not in history books. It's not something that you can speak about. It's like a date that we probably know quite well, which is the 6th of June, 1989, when the Tiananmen massacre happened. Should you search for it on the internet, you will probably see it on some red flags. So it might lead to your arrest. That's just, it's a state of censorship. It's a police state. So, yes, there are memories which I could access, but people in China can't. And so similarly, all through the book, I mean, that is something that I try to work with. Memories of what has happened in South Africa, and not just decades ago, things which have happened in the last decade, which we don't speak about, which I don't know that we've forgotten it, but we certainly self-censor with lots of things. And so I try and touch on some of those things in the book. Have I answered you?
Absolutely.
Not really.
No,
Sure.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you spend time in all of these different locations that you write in the book, and so I'm quite interested your experience of being in those locations and localities, and then having that sort of knowledge and experience to create these vivid places.
I mean, I think that when I lived in Shanghai for 3 years, I didn't have access to the city or to the information that I had when I left China, because, I mean, it was personal reasons. I was there with a small baby, so I couldn't really access. I couldn't speak the language. I'm halting Mandarin, really, really bad Mandarin. And so it was, the only way that I could understand the city was through fiction and through non-fiction, so through books. And I could only do that once I'd left China, because a lot of the things that I actually wanted to read or have access to would be banned. So there's a book which became really elemental to one of the main characters in my novel. It's called Tombstone by Yang Zhesheng. And so this is a non-fiction book where he's a journalist, actually, and in this extraordinary act of scholarship, he spent the bulk of his life, once he'd actually retired, or it might have been before he retired. I mean, I think he is probably about 80-odd years old now, living in Beijing, but for about 30, 40 years, he went from archive to archive, recording details of the people or the villages which had simply disappeared during the Great Leap Forward. So a book like that, it's just interesting, that I couldn't get that book in China, of course not. Firstly, there was English first, and then it was most likely, I don't know if it was banned on mainland China at the time that I was living there. It would certainly be banned today, because I think the laws have become more repressive. It's more of a police state today than it was 10 years ago. So that book, it's his memories, in fact, which, he's put into a book. And I don't think that young Chinese people have access to that kind of information or those memories. But the beauty of his book, and why it's so important, I think, that why we keep a record, is because when I could only access that book when, in fact, I read about it when we left China for a weekend. We went to Hong Kong, mainland China we went to Hong Kong. And Hong Kong back then, so more than a decade ago, was a lot more open. It's, the Chinese repression has extended to Hong Kong. I'm sure you all know about what happened in the last few years. But I read a review of Yang Zhesheng's book, Tombstone, when I was in Hong Kong. That weekend, I read about it. And I would never have accessed it if I had been in China, because they wouldn't have spoken about the book. So it's just, yeah.
Sure, lovely. Thank you. Joanne, the work of memory in this astounding book of yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Cindy. So the work of memory works on two levels for me. On the most superficial level, the inspiration for the book is the story of my great-grandmother on my mother's side. We really didn't have any of her history. When I asked the questions about who she was, why she came here, how she came here. My mother just didn't have answers to any of those questions. And I think, part of it arose out of the shame, part of it arose out of the trauma of what had happened to people during indenture. And as a result, entire lives were erased. And so for me, it became a personal project, firstly, of finding out about my great-grandmother, Adilakshmi Velanaikan, and then it became a project of drawing on the archives and the existing scholarship, of which there is a breadth, thankfully, that touches on the lives of so many indentured women who came at that time. And then I realized, this was going to be a fictional work that was going to draw in multiple experiences in order to tell the story through one protagonist. But when you talk about the work of memory, it makes me think of a phrase that Dr. Betty Govenden has used. She's a mentor and I think a really brilliant academic whose work a lot of us have benefited from in this country. And she speaks about the important memory work that needs to be done. She sees it as more than just a sort of foray into the idea of dredging up the past. She sees it as a responsibility that we have. And when you begin to look at it through that prism, a lot changes. Because all of a sudden, everyone involved in the national project of being South African or being African by extension starts to become implicated in the process of memorialization. I was going back to one of my academic proposals, and I came across this quote that I had found from Siobhan Nelson, who says, she was invited out, I'm paraphrasing now, but she was invited out by her friend to watch a screening of Hotel Rwanda. And she says, it was a Friday night. I didn't really feel like going out. I did not feel like witnessing the gruesome nature of it, the horror, the bloodshed, and the heroism. And her friend said, but it's the least you can do. And that, for me, is a massive departure point as to the responsibility we have in this country to go back into history and to remember in ways that are far more responsible and conscious. Yeah, that's really the thought that I want to leave us with as you tackle this section of the discussion, that it's not just nice to remember, it is important to remember. And if we treat that responsibility a little bit differently, I think it's almost a precursor to the process of healing in this country, where all the people you have who belong to all the Facebook groups that say, I do light reading because I just can't take the pressure of reading about difficult things. That's great. And it was we've just come out of COVID. It's been a difficult time for us. I think consuming this kind of literature can be quite draining. But when you're done, are you ever going to put the light stuff down? And are you ever going to engage our past as a member of the society who has a responsibility to remember? And that is my question to people who are running away from memory work.
Sure. Yikes.
Sorry, did I get all newsy?
Yo, I'm like, my goodness, thankfully I've already been paid. No, I'm joking, I'm kidding, I'm so sorry. To follow on from such incredible, thoughtful questions and responses. Because as C.A. Davidson, which is an incredible novel, I was thinking about the dimension of memory in a society where, in a state a condition of organized forgetting, right? That the state determines what is remembered and what not, and the political dimension that memory takes in that kind of space. And here with Joanne, at least what I was hearing is what it also means to write about people who, in a sense, were not seen as people, they were property, they were not comprehended as living, so their lives could not have been seen as lost. So what does that mean to actually bring them back to life, to bring those memories to life? Because the archive sees nothing lost. I thought that was incredible, but I don't know how to answer your question in relation to the book itself, because it's a compendium of so many different stories, but I would like to contribute to the discussion in a different way, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Earlier today, I I gambled on a horse, so it's coming in at 6:30. No, I'm joking. I
Share the spoils, Bongani.
yeah, I know. It's come stone last, sorry. I want to read a passage from, because earlier today it got me thinking. There's a book that I've been reading quite a lot about memory for my own other work, and two books that have been kind of like really good, which I've read quite recently. One is called In Memory of Memory, and the other is called The Primer for Forgetting, Getting Past the Past. And A Primer for Forgetting by Lewis Hyde begins, I think it begins with a note that oral societies keep themselves in equilibrium by sloughing off what's no longer useful, so they don't pass on everything wholesale. So there's this memory and forgetting work hand in hand, right? Like that's the argument that he's trying to make. But there's this little passage that I would like to share because I think it would contribute to the discussion, and maybe we'll talk about the book at a later stage, right? So this is what it says, right? In a long 2017 Facebook post, the Dine or Navarajo activist, artist, and ceremonial leader Pat McCabe, also known as Woman Standing Shining, explained the resistance to the call to never forget. McCabe had once worked as a shamanic healer to address her serial depressions. During one session, she had a vision of living in Canyon de Shelly, forgive me if I'm mistaking them, on Navajo tribal lands, and witnessing a massacre of her people at the hands of, in quotations, beings who had the appearance of humans, who were all identically dressed in blue. Over the years, her vision kept returning until she finally sought out a place where the events might have occurred, a place aptly named Massacre Cave. There she unexpectedly found herself praying. I began to address my ancestors. I said to them that we would love them always and forever, but somehow we must forget or let go of all the violence that had come before now, or we ourselves would complete the job of genocide that the US government began. I begged them, my ancestors, to let us go free. I told them they must find their way all the way home to the spirit world. And this is the last part. And then I prayed with all my heart and all my tears and asked for the Creator to open the gate for them to travel and to leave us in peace, and for them to find peace beyond the gate, and for each of us to travel in the correct way once again, each in our own world, me in this earthwalk world, and they as our ancestors in the spirit world. And I know like there's kind of, I don't fully agree with it, but I thought it was an interesting provocation to kind of bring also to this kind of discussion that where does the work of forgetting also kind of come in? And just one last thing I'll say is that in the piece that I kind of read from, it's a story about my grandfather who was killed in 1979 at the tail end of the Liberation War in Zimbabwe. And my grandmother, who until she passed in 2019, 40 years after that event, I can only count 2 times in which she spoke about it. And in those 2 times, it was less than 2 minutes. Each time was less than kind of 2 minutes. And so 40 years later, I found myself with this story that we were never even told about. So I wanted to kind of write about that. And so I'm in a different position. Like I can't forget because it would feel unethical. It wouldn't feel right. But I like the provocation that I just wanted to put that on the table, not for you to answer, but just to put it out there as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Can I add something quickly?
Yes,
Cindy?
please.
So I also work for a museum, at a museum, not a curator. But when I go around the slave lodge with the curator there, and he's a historian, and she tells the story of slavery at the Cape, it's hard to listen to. It's a very, very difficult history. And she says what her colleagues at the, I think it's the African American Museum at the Smithsonian, what they've always said to her, but it's the truth. And so you have to sit with the truth. I'm not disagreeing with you because I absolutely heard that, but it's hard and it's very difficult to remember. I mean, it also, what Joanne was saying, that's I feel the same way. But then I think there are also, just to be complicated, you have a state which does erase memory, you know, so this is, so I guess you're trying to work against something which is an active state suppressing and reversing and undoing, you know, what has happened. So, yeah. Sorry, I don't know if I helped or not.
Cindy, may I add to that as well, please?
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking, maybe I'm answering your question, Bongani, because when I read your book, one of the chapters has been contributed by Madeleine Fullard, who works for the NPA's Missing Persons Task Team. And so she and her team have spent a lot of years going back to find the bodies of anti-apartheid fighters who went missing over the decades, and you know, they try and recover those bodies, and they try and return as many of the fragments of those bodies to the families as possible so they can finally have closure. And, you know, I thought so much of that commitment to going back to finding all the physical evidence that is available. I was very privileged to go on a shoot with them and watch them, you know, essentially exhume some of those bodies from the graves and work very reverently with the bones of people who've passed in such violent circumstances. And, you know, I had reason to speak to one of the anthropologists. She's a forensic expert who's working as part of the team, Claudia Biso, who had worked in very many other areas in the world. So she's worked in Bosnia after the genocide. She's worked, you know, if I'm not mistaken, she was somehow involved in 9/11 as well. And she compares the process of gathering those fragments in different environments. The Bosnian government did not care to remember. They did not really want them there, and so they didn't facilitate that process in any way. In South Africa, the process is being carried out, but not with much assistance from the government. This is a small team that's up against the clock with very few resources. Time is running out, files are being destroyed, the main witnesses are dying as we speak. So history is dying with them, and secrets are dying with them. But in the US, post 9/11, the forensic experts who worked on that scene recovered every possible DNA fragment that they could, because every cell of every American person that remained on that scene was important to them. And I think of having gone to Rwanda and seen the skulls piled up there. We don't know who they were. My friend Mark Klusner, who's a journalist, tells me about the skeleton of a tiny child in a red dress with a bullet hole in her skull. We don't know who she was. Why do we not know who she was? Why are the skulls piled up into pyramids without names? And what responsibility do we have as Africans to commit ourselves to remembering and making sure that every fragment of our ancestors, our relatives, our fellow country people is returned to the families, is returned to a state of dignity in their burials. And unless we as ordinary people and as a society give value to that, it isn't going to mean much in the long run.
Thank you so much. I just also want to add to that, in that another meaning for the word remember is to actually bring together the members of the family, right? Isn't that the other meaning of the word? And I quite like that. And then just on the question of forgetting, I think partly the thing about why it's impossible in our context to forget, I guess, is that because we end up repeating the same crime of totalitarian regimes, right? Because they want us to forget, they want to obliterate lives into amnesia. So that's why I think there's that ethical dimension. But I was also thinking now, coming back in relation to the book, there's, I think, two quotes that I'm thinking about. One is by an artist in the US who says, "Heaven is being a memory for others." And I find that really beautiful. And then there's an Indian journalist who wrote about India's participation in the Second World War in a book called The Father's Field. And he says that people die two deaths, one at the end of their lives and the second at the end of the memory of their lives, when all of those who remember them are gone. and what war does, or what kind of, the kinds of violences that we've come from, is that it brings those two deaths close because it chooses young people specifically to die. So people die when they're very young in wartime situations. And so like this idea of then heaven becoming a memory for others, of the ethical dimension of remembering, I think this is what some of the contributors do. And then to come back also to Madeleine Fullard's piece. Madeleine Fullard's piece is like really extraordinary because in a sense you've got people who've been waiting since the 60s, some as far back as the 60s, for just to get the remains of their loved ones, because they know that the loved ones are no longer. But she's also said, I think you can also testify to this when you've spoken to the team, that for some people, because it's the missing persons task team, for some people, they think that person is going to walk through the door until the member of the team comes and says, we've found the remains. So in kind of like in situations like that, it's impossible to forget. But I'm also interested though, like, is it not necessary to also, what would take us to a point where we can forget, not to forget entirely, but is there no place at all? I think this is what I'm trying to ask. And what are the conditions necessary? And also, like, even in our own lives, we don't carry everything through. What are those things that we carry through, and what, I guess, what would it take to digest the past so that it can live there, but not to kind of hold you with it? I don't know, I just wanted to pose that as a question as well.
Sure. Thank you. On that note, what do we carry forward with us? I'm just thinking about all three of your works, and Mahmoud Darwish talks about the memory of forgetfulness, right? And can you perhaps comment on the various traumatic phantoms that appear and reappear throughout your writing? And how can we relate these traumatic phantoms with the concept of memory? Because there are repetitions that I noticed in all three works. I'm thinking about the Descendants, your specific one in particular, but I just wanted to talk about that sort of the appearance and the reappearance, this lingering phantom that emerges in the writing, and how you were able to grapple with memory and how with the concept of memory through those phantoms.
You going first.
Wow. I don't know that I completely have, Cindy. It was a very emotional experience writing the book because I found some peace in pulling my great-grandmother out of obscurity. I worried that she was a woman who would be forgotten, whose life and memory and work to establish our family would simply go unrewarded, unremarked upon. And in a way that still haunts me today, because I feel there's so many other women in that position throughout history whose stories will never be told. So the biggest bugbear that haunts me is history, right? The stories of the women that remain untold. And how does one grapple with them? I remember sitting with the photograph, the only photograph of her that remains. And she sits there with her sari on, and she has a sister standing next to her, and there's a child standing next to her. I don't know who the child is. And I remember gazing into that photo for a long time as if I were tunneling through her eyes into the past. And I was trying to discern what she was thinking, how she was feeling as that photograph was taken. Was she aware of how poor she looked in the photograph? Was she aware that she was a member of a subjugated population? Was she aware, how aware was she of the politics of the day and how her life had been impacted upon that way? Was she looking into camera with a sense of pride in what she had achieved, in educating her children, in running a mission from her home for 30 years, in having escaped famine, poverty, potentially the deaths of her parents in India that brought her here together with her siblings? I don't know that there is a resolution other than to tell their stories. For me, literature is the only conduit, and there are many other art forms that can serve as similar conduits, but for me personally, literature is the conduit to exorcising those demons, allowing them to live again. I mean, I found a wonderful line in this book, the Dictionary of Lost Words. It says, "Words are tools for resurrection." And I was reading some of Bell Hooks's work again, rest her soul, and it spoke about, I've actually got the quote here, if you wouldn't mind me just looking it up. And
Is the Dictionary of Lost Words by John Freeman?
Pip Williams, yeah. And she says, "Moving from silence into speech is for the oppressed, the colonized, the exploited, and those who stand and struggle side by side, a gesture of defiance that heals, that makes new life and growth possible. It is that act of speech, of talking back, that is the expression of movement from object to subject, the liberated voice." And that's what literature allows us to do. It allows the subjugated peoples of the past who went to their graves, many of them in silence, to talk back. And that imbues them with the only shred of power potentially that we can offer them in this sort of modern setting that I think is possible.
Sure. Sure. Wonderful.
So, I mean, I just want to go back a little bit. So I think we can distinguish between, in whose memory in whose service do we remember, and in whose service do we forget? And I think those are sometimes opposing forces. So, I mean, until that's resolved, to answer your, I don't know that we can forget until that is resolved. That was the one thing. And then just about the phantom, I mean, there is an actual, not really a phantom in my novel. I mean, it's quite hard and fast fiction. It's not speculative, but there is kind of a phantom. And I think it's because there are phantoms, you know, in the real world that we haven't quite grappled with. And it goes back to this issue of memory and in whose service do we remember or forget? Because, I mean, I do reference two young people that were in fact murdered in 1989 in Cape Town. It's Colleen Williams and Robbie Waterwich. And they were murdered and most likely betrayed. And their families still don't have any sort of closure. They don't really know what happened. So, you know, until we resolve, I mean, that's in my lifetime, you know, I mean, it's in all of our lifetime, but they would have been my contemporaries if they had been alive. They would have been, you know, not too much older than me, a year or two older. So, you know, yeah, we're using literature, I think, as Joanne said, you know, it is a tool, but the phantoms are, I feel, here because until their memories are resolved, and I don't mean necessarily in a spiritual way, although I'm very happy for someone else to, I mean, you know, it's about justice, it's about reconciling our current to our past. It's about censorship as well, because why have we not resolved their deaths? In whose, you know, in whose service do we forget that these two young people, in fact, sacrificed their lives for this country? So, yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you. Bongani, I have noticed time.
I'll be quick, yeah?
So, no, don't.
Okay.
Just want to open up.
Okay. So the Descendants kind of came about in sort of 2020, 21 during the first months of the pandemic. Like, I took out my tape recorder, I sat with my mother, and I said, this is the story that we haven't really talked about. And this is an uncertain time. And so we just sat in the living room in the afternoons. I put my tape recorder, went as far back as we could go, and then we came to that foundational break, the 1979, what happens there. And like even on the tape, like I haven't gone back to listen to it. I know that she cries quite a bit because she says they were meant to, so she's got two letters from 1979. The one is, because they were urging him, she was in the capital, she says, she's urging him to leave. And he says, no, things are terrible this way, but I'm going to leave. And then the day that he was going to leave the next day when he was abducted from his home. And she's got the letter that arrives and that says, in case of death, do this, do this, do this. Like to this day, in 1979, those 2 letters, she's got them in that kind of possession and like talking through that and it's a project that is still ongoing. And I think it had always it had haunted me or haunted our family in different ways, because I promise I'm going to wrap this up quickly. The first is when she left, when she ran that particular day, when she escaped, because they were meant to be abducted together. She ended up living at the place that I grew up in. And every time in black neighborhoods, it's like this. When people ask you, where do you come from? They actually mean, where's your rural home? Where's that? But we never went back to the rural areas. Like our home was kind of this place this house was in Hatfield. So I thought about her as, and I struggled with that from primary school, because teachers, when they mark your homework, are like, we come from this kind of conceptual framework where you have to go further and further back. And she was like this kind of biblical character. Who's the person that's not meant to look back? Lot. Kind of not meant to look back because everything is going to turn to salt. But I don't know what visions she had of that burning city she was leaving behind. So she never talked about it. And then I think what becomes interesting is that, like your great-grandmother, is that this memory somehow like comes to you and you have to, I'm getting kind of lost, but yeah, and there were just these 2 photographs of him in the house that nobody kind of pointed to or referenced to. They never actually said, my father did this, or my husband did this. There was this kind of silence. And come to think of it, how I understand it as well is, I don't see it as also like, there's the whole idea of trauma and things becoming unspeakable. But I also see that she was there's this political project she was engaged in, and she's trying to say, I'm trying to give you guys a new time. This stuff that we've come from, that's mine, but it's also ours, I understand that. Whether that project succeeded or not, but she was trying to leave war behind. And how she knows is that I'm never going back to that place, because part of it is that the neighbors were involved in his abduction. So every time I go to this place, there's this silence, and I have to participate in this, so I'm never going back, you're not going back. Whether it was right or wrong, in the end, she passed away in 2019, and late 2019, that was the last time I was there, and taking her from that home, and taking her back to the farm, and putting her in the ground. Oof. I'll pause.
Okay. Thank you. I want to, if it's okay, I'd like to invite everybody here with us to ask some questions of you and everything that we've just discussed now with the politics of memory and the imperative and the ethics of it and forgetting. And so anybody in the audience that would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. There's someone in the back with a mic. There's a mic.
Hi guys. Thanks so much for being here and discussing your work. My name is Sue. I was really interested in what Joanna and Bongani were saying about the duty of memory and that where does forgetting come into that. And I was just thinking about those two in opposition, memory and forgetting, and how both of them are almost imbued with a sense of longing, depending on the circumstance and the context. And thinking what you were just speaking about, Bongani, how do you extract memory when it wants to be forgotten?
Sue, did you ask how do you extract memory when it wants to be left alone? Is that? I mean, that's a really difficult question to answer, because memory is connected to human beings. It exists because we exist. And in a way, I feel like I only half answered Cindy's question about the ghosts that exist today and exorcising those ghosts, because actually, come to think of it, as just processing what you were saying about your grandmother, and those ghosts are in our bones. And those memories are in our bones, whether we'd like to admit it or not. And perhaps it's not the process of doing memories work for its sake, but to actually exercise our own demons. You mentioned in a panel earlier today, Bongani, you spoke about Marion Hirsch's work on post-memory. And essentially, what Marion Hirsch is doing, she is the descendant of people who've survived the Holocaust, some of whom have died during the Holocaust. And she is talking about going back and revisiting these things that have been visited upon us without our having realized it. So when we are doing the work of memory, we're doing the work of freeing ourselves, in a way. And so it seems to me to be quite an important exercise, whether we are conscious of it or not. There are things that have traveled through generations, in our blood, in our veins, in our memory, in our DNA perhaps. I don't know about the physical composition of how they travel, the alchemy of how they travel through us, but they somehow do. Sitting and writing my book hauled me back to a time that I can't possibly have any memory of, and yet the sentiments around that time, the emotions around that time, were just so real for me while I was writing. And is it because I was able to imagine them really well, or is it because something of them, vestiges of them, live somewhere inside me, and I'm somehow remembering them? I don't know the answer to that. But in a way, for all people who are haunted by some kind of past, and I think most societies and most strains of different societies have these traumas given the violence of the past. I feel like a lot of us need to do that memory work in order to free ourselves today. Bongani?
Thank you so much. I'll be quick because I'm also aware of time. And thank you so much for a really beautiful panel and for great questions. As you know, I love this metaphor that long ago people used to measure time from the flood, right? Noah's flood. And I was thinking, when you said that question, I was thinking of Habiba Badaroun's, who's an amazing poet. And I think one of the best poets that we've got. So their family was forcibly removed from Claremont to Athlone. And there's this one poem she's got in 100 Silences about how her father it's called How Not to Stop. And how her father, when he drove her back from school, collected her from school, drove past that house and never looked at it because he built the front door with his own hands. Never looked at the door, and it's just like, you know the poem I'm talking about.
No.
It's like really incredible. Then in another collection, The History of Intimacy, because she was born the year after that forced removal in Athlone. And she says in that book, in that poem, I was their ghost child, a grief growing older and older. And I thought, wow. Because sometimes even, I guess, the memory also places demands on us as writers or as citizens or whatever. Sometimes I just wanted to say that. I don't know if it relates to the conversation at all. Sorry.
Yeah, I think it does.
Okay.
Yeah.
Another question? Oh, two questions.
Hi. I think this is a little bit related to what was just brought up, and it's a bit of a muddle in my head, so apologies if it doesn't come out very succinctly. But how do you reflect on or deal with almost the responsibility of the act of remembering? It's almost a very practical and factual question, because part of what you're doing is trying to bring facts to the front, and you don't know what you don't know. So you don't know when you've got all the facts on the table. But another question, or another side of this question, is also almost an ethical and I guess an emotional question, because you also are placed in the present, and you also do have your own maybe expectations and emotions of what you want to find in the act of remembering. And how do you feel about your role in
bringing certain things and maybe deciding to prioritize certain things, or maybe you are also a little bit biased in what you're searching for? Do you, yeah, I don't know if there's an end to this question, but can you reflect on that? Because I'm very curious. It's a big responsibility that you have.
I mean, look, I think the whole process of writing any body of work, it's subjective. So it is absolutely rooted in how you're going to perceive, you know, whatever and what you're looking for. So definitely, I mean, I think it's subjective. I wanted to just say as well, that people, I mean, we also forget because of trauma. We remember because of trauma, but we also purposely forget because of trauma. So the thing that happens, not just in China, but I think in other countries where, you know, there've been genocides or people actively want the next generation to forget because they need to move on. And so there was a big thing in, you know, I think 20 years ago when people started saying, you know, expecting South Africa to go in a particular trajectory, you know, be like Singapore, be like China, you know, they've put the past behind them. So there's a very clear distinction between what that generation experienced and what the next generation, therefore, the trajectory that they need to. So, I mean, there is that, I don't think I answered you. My apologies. The first part, I wasn't entirely sure. Sorry, so I'm going to let Joanne and...
Anybody else?
So that's such a good question. And I was reading something 2 days ago, James Snell asking, when we write the past, are we always writing the present? And the answer is probably yes, because we write with our 21st century sensibilities. There's no way we cannot inject those in. And if you are a feminist, there's a reason that you are writing from a woman's point of view. There's a reason that your main protagonists are women. There's a reason that you are talking to issues of intersectionality and that kind of thing, because that's really what grips you as a person. So there is that layering of the present onto the past. And so we call it historical fiction, but if we were to be honest with ourselves, we're actually writing the present under the umbrella of the past. That's probably the best way I can answer your question.
And also just the last thing, just a tiny thing, maybe it slightly deviates. It's from Svetlana Alexievich's book, Secondhand Time. Yeah. She has a quotation in the beginning where this one Russian writer says, the future is no longer standing in its proper place. And I guess from what we're seeing from voices of protest, even from young people, I think it's an admission that the future is no longer standing. It's not in its proper place. I don't know if that makes any kind of sense, because part of, and this is from C.A. Davis's book, you talk a little bit, or the character bit says that they had this dream of freedom, perhaps the most elemental dream there is. And part of our moment now is that that dream of freedom is not in front, it's not standing in its proper place. We're supposed to have ushered ourselves into a new time, but the new time has not yet come. So, I don't know, things are a little disjointed.
Sure. Thank you, all three of you. Thank you for the questions. I'm so sorry we can't get to the last question, but I'm aware of time. Thank you for making the time to be here. Thank you for engaging. Please get the books. All three authors will be around to sign your books, and you can meet them, and we can continue with these conversations on the outside. So thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you.